From the financial centers of the world, this is Bloomberg Markets with Alix Steel and Guy Johnson.
It is 10 a.m. in New York, 3 p.m. in London, 30 minutes into the trading day right here in the U.S. From New York, I'm Alix Steel, and my co-host for today, Francine Lacroix. Guy Johnson is off for the rest of the week. Welcome to Bloomberg Markets. Francine, thanks a lot for sticking with me. Obviously, we're still looking forward to the Fed and Powell tomorrow morning, but we also have some geopolitical issues now surfacing in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. This just happened about 4 or 5 minutes ago, and the first we heard about it was a tweet by the press secretary of the Pentagon saying that there was an explosion just outside Kabul airport. Now, remember, Alex, we knew that this or something like this could happen because we heard both from U.S. officials and U.K. officials saying that this is probably the most hectic, dangerous phase of the evacuation. We don't really know the size of the explosion that happened outside the airport, but the question is, what does it mean for evacuation efforts from now on?
Right, and the countdown to that October 31st deadline for U.S. troops as well. Okay, let's get your quick check-in here on the market. So the news earlier this morning, what came from Mr. Michael McKee in his interview with Esther George saying, let's get the party started. Let's do this. Let's taper. Let's get it going. The S&P down by about 0.1%, but not a lot of taper fears, clearly, when you see just not a lot of volatility in the market. You can look at the VIX right here to 1718, so still holding within that lower range. Where you are seeing the action is very similar to yesterday. We've seen like a 10 basis point move in the last 3 days when it comes to treasuries. Now you're at 136. That feels very big compared to where we were on Monday, up by 2 basis points. It was led yesterday by Europe, but continuing today here in Europe as well, here in U.S. as well as in Europe. We are seeing some kind of follow-through buying here on the dollar. We were seeing it this morning. We didn't see it yesterday. But now the dollar index up by 0.2%. So you could make the argument it's a little bit of a safety trade with the dollar, but you have the higher yields, you have the higher dollar. Equity market, not really doing that much, Fran.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the movement, of course, will be on what the Fed does, and the two great interviews that we heard from Jim Bullard and, of course, Esther George. Now, we start, though, with the crisis in Afghanistan, Alex, and the Pentagon is confirming that an explosion outside Kabul airport happened. Casualties at this moment are unclear, or how big the explosion has been. Joining us now is Hordern, our Bloomberg Washington correspondent. Anne-Marie, we're 5 days away from the event, the end of the evacuation, supposedly. How much does this impact the efforts to get Americans, to get British, and to get Afghans out?
Well, it's a very unpredictable situation right now, given that we have this explosion outside of the Kabul airport with the Pentagon confirming that news. And this is on the heels of the UK and the US, really in the middle of the night, sending out a security alert to all Americans, UK nationals, as well as other allies, to stay away from the airport. Now, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson had answered a question about this on Thursday, about the worries of a potential terror attack at the Kabul airport. And I believe he pointed to ISIS-K as the reason. And this is what U.S. officials have been saying. The reason why they didn't want to extend that withdrawal is because they are worried about a resurgence, given what is happening in Kabul, of the likes of ISIS-K, which is a sworn enemy of the Taliban. So it's a very unpredictable situation. The question is a very good one, Francine. Given what is happening in this explosion, how do you continue some of those civilian flights before you even start to wind down the army?
Yeah, we'll keep you updated. Anne-Marie, stick around for us as well. Anne-Marie Hordern from Bloomberg. We will update you on any headlines as they cross. Let's get to the markets here. They're all awaiting that Fed Chair Jay Powell's remarks tomorrow. What will he say about tapering in that virtual Jackson Hole gathering? Officials, in the meantime, underscoring increased risk from the Delta variant and their impact on the recovery, maybe with the exception of Esther George, Kansas City Fed president. She spoke earlier with Bloomberg's Michael McKee.
We will have to see what impact this flare-up in the virus might bring. So you could imagine that it might slow down some of the returns to the labor market, but I don't expect at this point that it will derail the economy as we saw last year when we first had to deal with the virus.
And Michael McKee, Bloomberg National Economics and Policy correspondent, joins us now. Michael, what was some big takeaways here from that interview?
Well, Esther George had her conference derailed by COVID, but at this point, she's expressing confidence that the economy will keep going. And like many of the members of the Fed, she's talking about the fact that the taper needs to get started. Now, she didn't put a timetable on it. It could be anywhere between now and the end of the year. But other Fed officials have said they'd like to see some more data, and it'll be interesting to see if Jay Powell embraces that tomorrow. The data we got today very hard to read because it didn't tell us a whole lot. We got the jobless claims numbers, and they went up to 348,000, but you can't even see the movement in the line there. That's probably just noise, not telling us anything about the virus and whether it is affecting the labor market at this point. We won't get a real jobs reading until a week from tomorrow when we get the payrolls number. Now, the other number that came out today was the revision to second quarter GDP, very backward looking, doesn't tell us a whole lot, but we go up by 0.1% to 6.6%, which is really good growth. The only new information in this is corporate profits, and I'm putting this up here because it's obviously important for you if you are investing in equities. Corporate profits, the white lines here, they are at an all-time record for the second quarter, and the percentage gain, 9.2%, was double the percentage gain of corporate profits in the first quarter. So up to this point, even though it's backward looking and we have finished the reporting season, the corporate numbers are looking pretty good. And the thing I should mention this, Alex, corporate profits as put out by the government include private companies as well as the public companies, so the numbers don't necessarily match up to what we got from the S&P reporting season, but they do show that you're going to make some money in equities, or you made some money in equities based on that quarter.
All right, Michael, thanks so much. Michael McKee there, of course, who will be following very closely Jackson Hole for us with a fantastic interview from Esther George. And of course, on the back of these two hawkish views from Jim Bullard and Esther George, markets drifting a little bit lower. Tune in to Bloomberg TV for the Jackson Hole Symposium. We'll bring you all of the key moments right here throughout tomorrow. Now, Deutsche Bank's asset management arm, DWS Group, slumped after a probe into the sustainability claims. Joining us now is Sri Natarajan. He is Bloomberg senior banking reporter. Sri, thank you for joining us. I mean, this feels like a huge deal, not only for DWS, but just in general, how the financial community needs to deal to avoid greenwashing.
That's absolutely right, Francine. Let's take a step back and look at what's happened. DWS stock has slumped the most in 18 months. This happened after reports last night first emerged that U.S. authorities and the SEC are looking into reports from a public whistleblower, DWS's former sustainability chief, who came out and said that the asset management firm has been painting a rosier picture than reality merits about its ESG credentials and how it's applying its sustainability criteria. What has that led to? This morning, now that the report is out there that there are authorities investigating, even the local German regulator is investigating them, the stock was down 15%, the most since March, the most since the onset of the pandemic. Why is DWS important? DWS is a near $1 trillion asset management. Deutsche Bank owns about 80% of the firm. Therefore, its stock is also down roughly 3% earlier today. Now, and it's not just contained to DWS and DB here. The ESG space has seen a flood of money come in. Everyone has been touting the credentials of ESG and trying to attract investor assets. But with that kind of frenzy, there's also the risk that some people might have been cutting corners. And just one stat from our story this morning tells you the extent of the problem that could possibly exist. In the last 2 years, between 2018 and 2020, nearly $2 trillion in assets from European asset managers had to be stripped of the ESG label because regulators weren't convinced that they were applied correctly. Now imagine the concern for the sector if this DWS probe were to widen and everyone were to be under the lens of how they're using their ESG criteria.
Especially when like bonuses and raises could depend on all that too. Sri, thank you very much. Super solid. Sri Natarajan, thank you. All right, coming up, markets are all about what Fed Chair Jay Powell is going to say tomorrow, the distinction between tapering as well as tightening. Greg Jensen, Bridgewater Associates co-CIO, will be joining us next, how he's playing it into tomorrow. This is Bloomberg. I want to keep you updated on that breaking news from earlier. There has been a bomb blast outside the Kabul airport in Afghanistan. There's a Pentagon briefing in about 15-20 minutes time. I'm bringing that to you as any news crosses, as well as the press briefing as we try and get more details on the bombing. All right, let's get to the market. You're looking at a live shot there of Afghanistan and looking closely to see where outside the airport there as well. We'll bring you any headlines as they cross. Okay, let's get to the markets here. You got Bank of America lowering its 10-year rate call all the way back to 1.55. That's a pretty punchy move in the bond market over the last few days. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle is here with some of the technical levels that were breached. Hey, Abigail.
Well, Alex, it's really interesting because we do have this big backup in rates. The 10-year yield a month ago closer to 1.12%, now at 1.36%. So a pretty big backup, a quarter of a point in a very short period of time. Now, some folks are paying attention to what looks like it could be a death cross, or when the 50-day moving average moves through the 200-day moving average, signaling more downside for yields. In other words, bonds could rally. However, if we go into the Bloomberg terminal, that may not be exactly what we're looking at on a quick glance here. So this is a 5-year chart of the 10-year yield. Since the Fed has been in place since 2008, there have been roughly 7 death crosses. Most of them do signal downside for the 10-year yield. But here we had one where it was actually ahead of a backup in yield. And I would make the case here, it's hard to know whether this is a death cross or a golden cross, because you see the 200-day moving average going sharply higher, representing the massive backup in yield out of the pandemic lows, while the 50-day moving average is moving down. And there are other reasons, in fact, to think that you're going to see the 10-year yields continue to climb, continue to hold that uptrend over the last year. This entire pattern here, Bank of America or B of A Securities, Paul Ciana, the head of FIC Technical Analysis, he thinks that whole area, if current levels hold, could actually bring us back closer to 3%. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. But either way, lots of volatility ahead for yields.
Abigail, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle there with some of the technical levels that we should be watching out for. Now, joining us is Greg Jensen. He is Bridgewater Associates Co-Chief Investment Officer. Greg, thank you for joining us on a day where actually we look at some of the foreign affairs risks, but much more than that. We really look at Jackson Hole and what Jay Powell could say. We had 2 hawkish comments, not only from Jim Bullard, but from Esther George. Is this a timeline problem? So if you want to make sure that actually you can work with interest rates, tapering needs to come soon, no matter really what happens with inflation.
Well, I think the important thing as you talk about interest rates and the Fed is recognizing how different the world we're in today than the world we've mostly experienced. And when you think about interest rates, it's really not the private sector driving interest rates, reflecting economic conditions. It's much more what policy do central bankers want to have happen? Even so, they move from controlling short rates to controlling short rates, and to some degree controlling long rates, and also to some degree controlling corporate spreads. So when you think about the policy they're trying to drive, the big thing that's going to drive bond yields is when this what we call MP3 policy, the fusion of monetary and fiscal policy, creates outcomes that the central bank no longer desires. And that's where we sort of are. Right now, they can control the interest rate and through fiscal policy, in a sense, control nominal GDP. But there are consequences, and the consequences are higher inflation, the consequences are bubbles, and the consequences are eventually currency risk. And you're 2 out of 3. There's certainly some bubble activities in different areas of financial markets. There's certainly inflation well above their target, and we think it will continue to accelerate if the Fed doesn't move. And the third thing, eventually, as you get these types of policies, you'll see more currency volatility. So that's, I think, what the Fed will be watching. That's certainly what we're watching. And as a result of that, we expect the tapering to be faster than markets are currently expecting, rates to actually rise faster than markets are currently expecting, because the economy is going to pull the Fed. So despite the fact that the Fed's going to be record easy, the economy is going to pull the Fed gradually.
Okay, so in that case, what do you need to be buying in equities? I was struck then 13F filings, the recent additions were all the safety guys, J&J, Procter & Gamble, Pepsi, Coke. Relate the two together for me.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest arbitrage you can sort of take in the world right now is take what the policymakers are giving you. They're giving you incredibly low interest rates relative to high nominal GDP growth. And so if you can hedge that, if you can essentially take in cash flows that will move something like nominal GDP and hedge, being short treasuries or other instruments that allow you to hedge the risk. The main risk is that the Fed has to tighten faster than people expect, that the liquidity that has supported asset markets and created bubbles will have to be withdrawn. Now, some equities, the equities that really have cash flows and earnings driven by nominal GDP, should be okay. The assets that require constant liquidity infusion because they don't actually, they're not profitable, they're not themselves able to support create the cash flows to support the asset prices, but require more and more liquidity in financial markets to hold those asset prices. That's where we'd be nervous about those equities and more bullish on the equities whose cash flows will be driven with the continued strength in nominal GDP.
Greg, how do you look at the Delta variant, right? So we're monitoring closely. I'm sure the Fed is, but if the Delta variant gets worse, can the Fed still withdraw liquidity without derailing the economy?
Yeah, well, this certainly slows the timeline down to a certain degree. I think overall we monitor, and I think the data on mobility suggests that many economic participants are willing to get on with their lives and are still moving around. It is a negative. It does slow the timetable. You're seeing it to a certain extent in the economic stats, but the bigger picture direction appears clear that one way or the other, we're going to live with the virus. The vaccines are working to lower the death rate. The economies across the world are coming back online. The US is leading because its fiscal policy has been so extreme, but the rest of the world is lagging and following. And that's occurring despite the difficulties that the Delta variant and probably future variants will cause. So it matters. It certainly affects the timeline of these decisions, but it's not, in our view, changing the fate and the likely direction.
So, Greg, that kind of leads me indirectly to China, because China seems to have adopted a zero tolerance policy, which has really put the government in somewhat of a bind. I mean, we saw today in one of the papers that sort of fronts what the government says, that they're going to keep pumping credit into the economy to help support it as they have this zero tolerance policy. That's one hand. On the other hand, you have this regulatory crackdown in big tech and other sectors as well. How do you play China with those two things in mind?
Yeah, well, I think when you watch China, when we watch China, what we see is them balancing several very important things: common prosperity, the fact that they want to change the distribution of income. At the same time, they're trying to build their financial markets and want global investors they recognize to be a superpower. You must have viable financial markets. So it looks from an outside perspective often like, oh, they're moving away from the desire to shift towards financial markets, but it's more balancing multiple goals simultaneously. And when you look at their history, they've generally successfully handled multiple goals simultaneously, and we expect that's the most likely scenario today. And with the variant, I think it's important across the world to say, if the variant gets worse, what will happen with policy? Just like you mentioned the China case, but this is true in the US or whatever, that what'll happen. There'll be easier monetary policy and fiscal support if the virus gets worse. So actually the biggest risk to markets is less that a downturn, because we know how policymakers will respond to that. It's much more that inflation and bubbles create a need for the central bank to tighten faster than people are expecting. That's actually a much more significant risk that needs to be hedged, because policymakers will ease if necessary with respect to the virus.
Greg, is there anything actually in the China space right now, Chinese equities, that you would be buying?
Yeah, overall, I mean, the big thing in Chinese equities is we think so many people are underexposed, that the reverse is basically the problem we see the most, which is everybody is overexposed to U.S. assets. U.S. assets are the most expensive, probably face some of the biggest challenges around the liquidity policy being withdrawn the quickest, and inflation challenges. So when you look at that, and you look at how essentially 60% of global investors' portfolios are in U.S. equities that make up something like the U.S. makes up about 25% of the global economy. You reverse that and see global investors have something like 5% of their assets in China, where China makes up almost an equivalent amount of the economy. There is this huge mismatch that we do expect a decade from now will be reconciled one way or the other, and that in the short term, of course, there's all these challenges in the relationship between the U.S. and China, and that will be ongoing as well. But the big deal is the difference in asset prices reflect the risks in China, we think. The asset prices in the U.S. actually reflect very, very low risk premiums. So probably a little bit more dangerous than assets outside of the U.S.
Greg, that is such an excellent point. We really appreciate you having you on as always. Thank you very much, Greg Jensen of Bridgewater Associates. Want to update you on those headlines coming out of Afghanistan. Just to recap here, the Pentagon says an explosion has happened outside of Kabul airport. Dow Jones is now reporting that the U.S. believes at least 3 U.S. troops are injured. Other outlets reporting that U.S. officials have said there have been casualties. Casualties are those that are either injured or killed. The Pentagon was due to speak at 10:30 for their daily briefing on Afghanistan, and that has now been pushed back. We don't know when that briefing will come, but we will take that for you when it does. You're looking at live shots there, as it looks like potentially U.S. believes at least 3 U.S. troops have been injured. That's according to Dow Jones. This is Bloomberg.
Well, investors getting conflicting signals on the reopen versus stay-at-home trade. Both seem to be stuck below early year peaks. I can't get my words out today. Bloomberg's Dave Wilson is actually looking at the contrasts. David, what do you have?
Well, Fran, I mean, if you look at Citigroup index of stay-at-home stocks and the Goldman Sachs index of reopening stocks, if you will, I mean, they're kind of telling the same story to some extent. Citi's index peaked back in February. It's really tailed off since then. But the Goldman gauge in June reached its high, and it's been coming down as well. In fact, it's off as much as 14% from that peak. So, in the back and forth between are people staying home or are people getting back out again, I mean, it's sort of a standoff here. And you can understand it sort of focusing in on some data that plays into the reopening argument. Whether you look at people going back to the office or you look at U.S. airline passengers going through security or restaurant patrons. The data series that track those are kind of rolling over, as the chart watchers would say. The numbers have been coming down the last few weeks, so you'd expect to kind of see the shares follow along. And indeed, I mean, the numbers really do tell the tale when it comes to perhaps the effect of the Delta variant spread, when it comes to people being willing to get out and go to work, take a flight, go to eat out at a restaurant. And you even see it here in New York City with the latest data from the Partnership for NYC and pull it all together, and it does tell you why the stay-at-home trade, the reopening trade has struggled.
All right, Dave, thanks very much. Bloomberg's Dave Wilson joining us there. I want to recap those Afghanistan headlines for you. The Pentagon does say an explosion at Kabul airport has taken place outside Kabul airport. Dow Jones reporting that the U.S. believes at least 3 U.S. troops have been injured. The NASDAQ 100 and the S&P 500 have dropped now to a session low. We're going to bring you more headlines and updates as they cross. This is Bloomberg.
Live pictures there outside, actually listening to what seems like a lot of commotion on the ground of Kabul airport over in Afghanistan. The U.S. has confirmed that there was a blast at an entry gate to Kabul airport just hours after Western intelligence agencies warned of imminent terrorist threats. Now, the U.K. has once again warned Afghans to avoid Kabul airport due to possible more terrorist attacks threats. That puts in question the evacuation efforts. Again, the clock is ticking because the evacuation efforts should be finished by August 31st. Now, joining us now is Anne-Marie Hordern, Bloomberg Washington correspondent. Anne-Marie, we're in touch with various authorities to try and understand exactly what's going on, to try and piece everything together. The first concern, of course, is the health of the people on the ground and what this means for evacuation efforts going forward.
Yeah, Francine, it's a very good point. We really need to take a step back and just take stock of the information we have. It's a very unpredictable and fluid situation. What I know is that the president has been briefed about this explosion, and what officials are telling Reuters is that it was via a suicide bomber, this explosion, and there are casualties. Now, we don't know whether or not that means injuries or fatalities. There was supposed to be a Pentagon briefing kicking off around this time. That is now pushed back, I imagine, because they are very focused on this immediate threat to the airport, and we are just awaiting more details from the Pentagon. But this is what we know so far.
Anne-Marie, we're going to get back to you in just a few. You're going to be with us throughout the hour as well. Anne-Marie Hordern, thank you very much. We do want to take you, though, to some other breaking news here, and that is Blue Origin. It's gearing up for another rocket launch any moment. We are looking at that. This is the New Shepard. It's its next mission. It's going to fly a NASA lunar landing technology demonstration, a second time on the exterior of the booster. The reason why this is significant as you're looking at reusable rockets is the 17th New Shepard mission to date and the 8th flight of this particular vehicle dedicated to flying payloads to and from space.
1, 0.
And liftoff from West Texas. Mission Control has confirmed New Shepard has cleared the tower on her way to space from the West Texas desert, carrying lunar lander technology, as well as New Shepard's first ever art installation. You can see on your screen we're gaining speed as New Shepard lifts off towards space. In about 10 seconds here, we'll be coming up on max Q, which is the toughest point of flight for the vehicle itself. Look at her go. And we have successfully punched through max Q, where the aerodynamic stresses on the vehicle were at the maximum. Such a beautiful, clean burn on that BE-3 engine, and you see the West Texas desert disappearing away. As you can see on your screen, that altitude monitor and that velocity are on the bottom. She is really picking up speed on her way to space. Keep an eye out shortly for that main engine cutoff, where we'll cut off that BE-3 engine. New Shepard is now coasting at over 1,700 miles per hour. And there we have it, main engine cutoff. New Shepard is at 2,000 miles per hour, and those experiments are just seconds away from getting their several minutes of microgravity and performing their research. There is that 0G indicator on the screen. Shortly, you'll start to see those two distinct crafts as the booster starts heading back towards Earth, and those experiments.
You are watching the 17th launch of the New Shepard mission. It is the 8th flight for this particular vehicle, which is flying scientific and research payloads to and from space. That reusable rocket, key to making space flight cheaper as well as more efficient. You just saw the successful launch from the New Shepard mission. Want to get a little bit more detail here. Justin Bachman from Bloomberg is joining us. Justin, what's the significance of what we're watching right now?
Well, the big thing flying today is some equipment and sensor tests that Blue Origin is testing for NASA. And this would be how to land on the moon in terms of a descent and landing computer, as well as some radars that are needed for positioning and how to do that. And it's a really interesting situation because you also have Blue Origin fighting with NASA in Washington about not getting a lunar human lander contract earlier this year, which went to SpaceX. And so they appealed to the GAO and lost that, and now they've gone to a federal administrative court, and they're trying to get this overturned so that they can get a piece of this work for themselves. It's really an interesting fight right now with one of their big customers.
Yeah, and so what does it do for, like, how does that play out? Why does Blue Origin want/need that so much?
Well, I think in a lot of ways this has become a personal issue for Jeff Bezos. It's not about the money, and the size of this contract, $1 billion or $2 billion, is not huge in the grand scheme for him. But it's really, I think, about the message that SpaceX is not the only game in town. There are other players that want to do this kind of work. And, you know, government contract work is a very lucrative, steady stream. Once you get in, it's good work if you can get it. And I think that's part of what we're seeing here.
Talk to me about the significance of the fact that this is the 8th flight of this particular vehicle. We're looking at the 17th New Shepard mission to date. These are very high numbers in a short amount of time, in essence.
Yeah, they are. But this is really what we're talking about in the future of rocket reusability. You fly these things as many times as you can. SpaceX has flown one of their Falcon 9 first boosters for 10 times already, and say they could probably do another 10. So I think the key to getting costs down in launch is to really be able to reuse these things on a rapid cadence, and that's what you're seeing these two big companies are doing right now.
Yeah, and right now we're looking at the booster landing. Walk me through what's happening right now.
The booster comes down, it separates from the capsule in space, and then the capsule lands with parachutes a couple of minutes later nearby. But the booster does come back first and lands on those legs, and that's one reason that they can get it ready to fly again in 3-4 weeks, pretty quick.
And then what happens next now for Blue Origin, aside from the suit that they're undergoing with NASA? What's going to be next for them?
Well, they say they have another human flight planned for this year. No date was given today on their webcast for this event, but we could expect that in the next couple of months, I think. And, it's possible they could do 2, not just 1 this year, but I think that remains to be seen. And, the big news around this company is really what happens with NASA and their future with NASA as this goes through the courts and all the appeals for getting astronauts back to the moon.
You're looking at the booster now coming in to the atmosphere.
There go those drag brakes. This is a critical step in slowing the booster down on its approach. You see this velocity decreasing quite rapidly on the left side of your screen. Those in West Texas are now hearing that sonic boom. New Shepard is on approach. That BE-3 engine relay confirmed. Landing gear deployed. That beautiful hover. And booster touchdown, look at that, just like she was landing on the moon. Hopefully those NASA landing sensors got some incredible data today.
You heard that the booster landing was successful. This is the New Shepard mission, the 17th, the 8th flight for this particular vehicle. Of course, this part is key that the booster can land because it's how it's going to be reused, and that cuts time, it cuts costs for movement into space, whether you're delivering payloads or people. Bloomberg's Justin Bachman, thank you very much for joining us in this critical sort of shift and move into space for the global economy. Francine?
Alex, let's also go back to the developing story in Afghanistan. It was 49 minutes ago that we found out through Twitter, through the Pentagon press secretary, that there was an explosion outside Kabul airport. Now, since then, we're trying to piece exactly what happened. There are various reports of casualties, even of people dying. Now, the U.S. has confirmed that there was a blast at an entry gate to the airport. This comes hours after Western intelligence agencies actually warned of this imminent terrorist threats. We understand, again, this is not confirmed, but through media reports that this could be an Islamic group. We had, I think yesterday, heard from the U.S. president, that there could be Islamic State insurgents that could be plotting attacks on Kabul airport. So we'll have plenty more on this throughout the day. These are live pictures from Afghanistan, Kabul.
This is Bloomberg Markets. I'm Alix Steel, and you're looking at a live shot of the principal room. Mary Barra, Chairman and CEO of General Motors, coming up at 12 p.m. in New York, 5 p.m. in London. This is Bloomberg.
About 50 minutes ago, we heard, of course, through the Twitter page of the Pentagon of this explosion in Kabul. Now, we're monitoring a number of media organizations, a number of people on the ground to try and figure out exactly what had happened. We understand through various sources that there are casualties. Just 5 minutes ago, the Pentagon press secretary said there are a number of casualties, but he doesn't want to say too much until they have everything confirmed. Also speculation that this could actually come from a Islamic group, the Islamic State insurgents that Joe Biden was talking about over the last couple of days. This would be a splinter cell that, Alex, does not have friendly relations with the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Yeah, we do have a tweet from Politico that specifically says a suicide bomber was responsible for that explosion. So we're still sort of trying to cobble the details all together here on that. Let's get more details with Bloomberg's Marty Schenker and Anne-Marie Hordern from D.C. Marty, first, just set the stage for us here. First of all, was this a surprise? Was this definitely going to happen? What's happening right now on the ground in your best knowledge?
Well, you know, we're cobbling together from various sources. We do not have people on the ground there. Bloomberg doesn't, but there are a number of news organizations that do. Joe Biden very specifically warned that a terror attack was quite possible. So to the extent that, you know, he did warn the public, but still this is a shock and a surprise, certainly to the people on the ground. And it just adds to the narrative that this is a chaotic departure from Afghanistan.
What does that mean, Anne-Marie, for evacuation efforts? What are you hearing from the White House? Again, it hasn't even been an hour yet. I know that a lot of the diplomatic missions are trying to figure out who is hurt, and what happens to evacuation efforts.
Well, I imagine we'll get that news throughout the day. The president at the moment is with his national security team in the Situation Room. Sources told our Jennifer Jacobs. So when he comes out from that and we finally get that Pentagon briefing, we'll get an update on exactly what is happening on the ground in terms of casualties. Are these injured? Are these fatalities? Was it a suicide bomber? How many of these explosions were there? But as Marty said, the president has said himself, we heard just yesterday from the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, saying it is a very real threat about the security concerns given ISIS-K. Now, I think, and Marty would know a lot about this as well, I think it's important to distinguish between the Taliban, which is controlling Kabul, but ISIS-K, which is an enemy of the Taliban. And a recent UN security report had said there is still about 1,000 to 2,000 members of ISIS-K. And they are a very, very strong militant terrorist group. And they're the offshoot of what you've seen in Syria and in Iraq of ISIS. But what we do know right now is that the president is being briefed on all of this. And it is going to hinder, as you say, those evacuations. Because we heard in the middle of the night, Kabul time, just after 3:30 a.m., the U.S. Embassy was sending out this security alert, letting Americans know to stay away from the airport. If you're near a gate, get away. So at the moment, we already knew that things were going to have to start to slow down because they were concerns about security of those near the Kabul airport.
Marty?
Yeah, Anne-Marie is absolutely correct. ISIS-K is a splinter group. They have no friendly relations with the Taliban, let alone the United States and the NATO allies. So this was always a threat. I mean, I guess to a certain extent, the consolation is our intelligence seems to have been quite good, that there was an imminent attack possible, and hopefully Americans did stay away from the airport on the basis of this warning. And I would assume that departures of aircraft will resume once they've secured the area, but it does slow down the evacuation, there's no doubt about that.
Well, I was going to say, does this speed it up or slow it? I understand how it slows it, but I can also imagine that the urgency then to get out completely is even greater, even before that deadline.
No question about that. And actually, the numbers of people that were being pulled out of Kabul was fairly amazing over the last couple of days. Tens of thousands have left. There have got to be thousands more who want to leave and who are scheduled to leave. And the issue that Joe Biden and his administration faces is you cannot leave Americans behind. I mean, the political danger of that is great, let alone the humanitarian issues. So they will, as soon as they can resume flights, you can bet that they will be leaving fast and furious.
Marty, there was that deadline of August 31st for Americans and allies to get out. Does that now get extended?
Well, I mean, Joe Biden has steadfastly said they're going to stick to that deadline. You know, there are some significant logistical issues. The last people to leave are the military themselves, and there are varying reports of how long that alone will take. And you can't start doing that until you've gotten all the people out, the civilians out that you want. So it's going to be tough to meet that deadline, but so far the Biden administration is sticking to its commitment of August 31st.
All right, Marty, thank you very much. Bloomberg's Marty Schenker, also Anne-Marie Hordern, thanks so much joining us there. You'll be sticking with us and give us any updates as they cross. Joining us now is Congressman Warren Davidson of Ionon, Ohio? Ohio. Yeah, well, what do you know right now?
I mean, a lot of what you are reporting, but just before news of the explosion, we had received reports from American civilians on the ground that they were unable to be evacuated at Kabul. So then there was an explosion. So the security situation at the Kabul airport had already started breaking down ahead of that explosion. There were obviously warnings that there could be an ISIS or Al-Qaeda attack. And so Taliban doesn't have full control of the area, or if they do, you know, and they claim they do, then clearly they're accountable for reining in ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And I mean, that's the challenge before, right? That's why we had to go in and impose order in Afghanistan for, I don't think we needed to for 20 years in the way that we did, but the reality is we did, and we kept ISIS and Al-Qaeda at bay broadly. Certainly they conducted terror attacks all throughout this stretch of time. And with this mass of people in one location, it's a ripe target.
So, Congressman, do we know exactly the exact number of Americans still left on the ground in Afghanistan? And it seems critical what U.S. troops on the ground do in the next couple of days. What could that look like?
Well, what I hope it looks like is that Joe Biden, our commander-in-chief, quits worrying about a date and starts worrying about getting every single American out. There is no limitation on the amount of force that Joe Biden and this administration could use against the Taliban, against ISIS, or against Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to keep Americans secure. There's no restrictions on his ability to use force. The restriction is his will to do it, and the authorization should be clear. We will get every single American who wants out, and we should do the same for our allies and those who helped us. We saw last night Poland say that they're going to stop evacuating. I don't know that they feel they've got every Polish person out that they want to. So in a collaborative way, those who've helped us, we should be helping them get safely out of Afghanistan.
So, Congressman, what in actuality does that mean? That does obviously not gel with getting everybody out by Tuesday. Does that imply we need more troops on the ground? Is that something you would advocate, pushing back that deadline? Walk me through the logistics of what that would actually look like in terms of U.S. presence.
Look, I was in Ranger Regiment a long time ago. Non-combatant evacuation operations, or NEO, are high-risk operations. They're under extreme security conditions, and you see one of the most extreme in history going on right now. But aside from what goes on right there at the airfield, or at hopefully at some point multiple airfields throughout Afghanistan to safely evacuate people throughout the country, you have to establish a secure perimeter. And, wherever people mass, just like at the airport, there might not be as many people at the gate right away. So we put TSA security up front. Well, there's still a big gathering of people before you get into the secured area. So there's always going to be a perimeter, but you have to keep that area as secure. So that requires, I guess, a different posture than what we're using right now. And, whether we need more troops or not, we just need the engagement throughout the population to keep that area actually secure.
Right.
Clearly, there was a breakdown in that today.
Congressman, there are reports that this comes from Islamic State insurgents. If this is confirmed that it is ISIS-K, basically a splinter cell that think that the Taliban are too forward-looking, right, are too soft in terms of some of their views, how should the U.S. deal with them?
Well, my hope is that that not just the United States, but our allies and perhaps even the Taliban. I mean, ISIS wants to establish a caliphate. It's not clear that the Taliban has some kind of vision beyond their influence inside Afghanistan and inside Pakistan. So, we may find that the Taliban also doesn't want ISIS there. And that's certainly the only way they're going to be able to coexist because, look, it's clear the United States of America doesn't really want to stay in Afghanistan. But the way that we defeated ISIS in Syria and in western Iraq was a much better way to go about it than just occupying the ground and driving the same supply routes so that you can get hit with IEDs. We defeated ISIS. They lost all the terrain that they had in Syria and western Iraq because we used a different approach. And I think if you can have the Taliban as allies to take out ISIS and Al Qaeda, then hey, maybe there's a path for the Taliban to exist in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. But if they don't, then they're clearly the same enemy that we had to root out 20 years ago, and we just can't allow a sanctuary for terrorists.
Congressman, before we let you go, I just want to get your understanding of how the U.S. should work with the Taliban today if, in fact, this is a splintering. I mean, in some ways, you have to work then with the Taliban if this is if there's a terror attack now on Taliban soil. But how do we do that since we haven't even recognized the state?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that we have to work with the Taliban ever. And frankly, the working with the Taliban hasn't gone well. So they haven't met the conditions there. I mean, we didn't negotiate our way into Afghanistan the first time. We certainly shouldn't feel obligated to negotiate our way out. And if the Taliban wants to, have any future in Afghanistan, they're not going to be able to have it by attacking American citizens. And so it would be in the Taliban's best interest to, with no call or prompting from anyone in the United States of America, to find ISIS and root them out. Because if they don't do that today, they're not going to do that a month from now. They're not going to do that a year from now. They're not going to do that 5 years from now. And no matter how many times the ISIS comes up somewhere, we're just going to smoke them. That's what we need to do.
All right, Congressman, thank you so much. Warren Davidson there of Ohio. Alex, what we know is that there has been a reported suicide bombing at Kabul airport, unconfirmed, but a number of sources are saying that there could be at least 10 deaths. The incident, we understand, is at Abbey Gate at Kabul airport.
All right, well, in the markets, you are seeing the S&P now roll over to the lows of the session. We're now off by about 0.5 of 1%. You are seeing the dollar stay on with that safe haven bid of 0.3 of 1%. Yields, though, holding steady. European close up next. This is Bloomberg.